Imagine this. You're standing at the fish counter, bright lights above you, cold air drifting across crushed ice, rows of salmon fillets arranged with almost surgical precision. The flesh is perfectly pink, firm, clean, healthy looking. The labels are reassuring. Responsibly farmed, high in omega 3, heart healthy, sustainably sourced. Nothing about this moment feels uncertain. It feels modern, efficient, safe. My wife and I used to eat salmon regularly. For almost 2 decades, it was a staple in our home. Simple, healthy, reliable. Then a few years ago, a different message started circulating. Salmon is the most toxic food on the planet. Farmed salmon is poison. You're feeding your family chemicals. The headlines were strong. The tone was confident. And without really investigating the details, we stopped. We didn't analyze the data. We didn't read regulatory reports. We didn't look at contaminant comparisons. We just followed the alarm blindly. That sentence is important because it mirrors something else. When we used to eat salmon, we trusted blindly. When we stopped eating salmon, we reacted blindly. Both decisions were made without fully understanding the system, and that realization is what led me here. Because somewhere in your mind, almost automatically, a sentence forms when you stand at the counter. If it were dangerous, they wouldn't be allowed to sell it. That sentence is powerful because it's not really about salmon. It's about how modern civilization functions. You cannot personally test every food you eat. You cannot run laboratory analyses in your kitchen. You cannot follow global supply chains from Norwegian fjords or Chilean coasts to your local supermarket. So you delegate. You trust regulators. You trust inspection agencies. You trust the invisible architecture of food safety that operates in the background of your life. And most of the time, that trust works. Modern food systems are not chaotic. Water is treated. Pathogens are monitored. Standards exist. But something subtle has shifted in the last 50 years. Trust has become automatic. It has become reflex. And when trust becomes reflex, curiosity becomes dormant. At the same time, distrust can also become reflex. And that's what's happened to us. We swung from automatic trust to automatic suspicion. Tonight is not about destroying trust. It's not about defending industry. It's not about inflaming fear. It's about examining the architecture underneath both trust and distrust. Because salmon is one of the most widely promoted, quote, health foods in the modern diet. Rich in omega-3 fats, high in protein, linked in large population studies to lower cardiovascular risk. A single serving can deliver meaningful amounts of EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fats involved in blood vessel flexibility, inflammation signaling, and brain structure. It is marketed not just as food, but as a prevention, heart protection, brain support, anti-inflammatory, which makes it the perfect case study. Because when a food is positioned as medicine, we rarely question its production. And when food is positioned as poison, we rarely question that either. So let's just slow down. Wild salmon live extraordinary lives. They migrate thousands of kilometers across open ocean. They swim against currents. They dodge predators. They navigate temperature shifts and ecological unpredictability. Their pink flesh develops naturally from eating crustaceans rich in astaxanthin. They grow according to environmental pressure. Energy expenditures shape their physiology. Farm salmon live in a different ecosystem. Large open net pens anchored in coastal waters, thousands of fish contained in relatively confined space. They do not migrate. They do not hunt. They are fed pellets formulated from fish meal, fish oil, plant proteins like soy, processed fats, vitamins, minerals, and pigmentation compounds. Without added pigment, their flesh would be pale gray. Consumers expect pink, so astaxanthin is added to feed, sometimes synthetic, sometimes derived from algae, chemically identical to the natural molecule. It supports fish health. It also makes the fish look the way people expect it to look. This detail alone is not sinister, but it reveals something important. The salmon in front of you is not simply nature delivered. It is nature optimized, and optimization requires management. Now let's step back into something rarely shown in marketing imagery. When thousands of animals share limited water space, biology changes. Sea lice reproduce more efficiently. Pathogens spread more easily. Waste accumulates beneath pens. Oxygen dynamics shift. This is not scandal, it is destiny. And destiny requires intervention. To control sea lice, compounds such as amamectin benzoate may be used. Both treatments can involve hydrogen peroxide. In some regions, organophosphate treatments such as azaminothipios have been deployed. Synthetic pyrethroids like delamethrin and cypermethrin also have been used as parasite control tools. When bacterial infections occur, antibiotics such as oxytetracycline or fluorophenical may be administered under veterinary supervision and regulatory oversight. To prevent nets from clogging with algae and marine growth, copper-based anti-fouling coatings are applied. Equipment and infrastructure may be disinfected using oxidizing agents like peracectic acids. These are industrial compounds. And when certain treatments are applied, workers wear protective equipment. Gloves, respirators, protective suits, face shields. That image matters, not because it proves the final fillet is toxic, but because it grounds the conversation in physical reality. This is not a pastoral fishing village scene. This is industrial biological management. Continuous monitoring, continuous intervention, continuous calculation, and yet none of that is visible at the supermarket. You see a clean fillet, you see marketing language, you see a health claim. There is a gap between production and perception, and trust fills that gap, and sometimes fear fills that gap. Now let's widen the lens. Across Europe, North America, and elsewhere, monitoring programs routinely test salmon for contaminants, PCBs, dioxins, heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, and emerging concerns such as microplastics. Here's something that complicates the narrative. In certain regions, farm salmon has tested lower in some contaminants than wild salmon from the same waters. Why? Because feed inputs can be controlled, fish oil can be filtered, ingredients can be screened. Wild salmon migrate through oceans that have decades of industrial history. They accumulate what the marine environment contains. Farm salmon live shorter, more controlled lives. Reality does not fit simple slogans. Wild does not always mean cleaner. Farmed does not automatically mean dirtier. But here's a phrase that always ends the discussion: within regulatory limits. It sounds definitive, it sounds scientific, it sounds reassuring. But what does it actually mean? And once you understand that answer, you realize something important. My wife and I stopped eating salmon because we believed it was uniquely toxic. After looking at the data, the regulatory structure, and the comparative risk, we realized that claim was exaggerated. Not risk-free, not magical, but not the most toxic food on the planet either. So today, we eat salmon again, with awareness, not blindly. And that awareness is what this episode is really about. Let's go deeper. Because within limits is not just a phrase, it is a mathematical structure. And once you understand how that structure works, you begin to see modern safety differently. Imagine a laboratory. Researchers expose animals to increasing amounts of a compound. They observe when measurable harm appears. Maybe tumors, maybe organ stress, maybe reproductive changes. They determine the highest dose where no observable harm occurs. Then regulators step in, and they divide that number by 10, by 100, sometimes by 1,000. Why? To account for uncertainty, to account for differences between animals and humans, to account for sensitive populations, to account for lifetime exposure. The result becomes something called tolerable intake, a daily or weekly amount considered unlikely to cause measurable harm over a lifetime. That number becomes law. That number becomes policy. That number becomes the quiet line between legal and illegal. Now pause, because that process is rational. It is science-based. It is systematic, but it is not absolute. It is built on modeling, on assumptions, on averages. Average adult body weight, average consumption patterns, average metabolism. But people are not averages. Some people eat fish once a month. Others eat it daily. Some bodies detoxify efficiently. Others do not. Some are pregnant. Some are children. Some have genetic vulnerabilities. The system uses averages because law cannot function on infinite variability, but averages blur individually. Now add another layer. Regulators often evaluate chemicals one at a time, one compound, one threshold. But life is not single compound exposure. You eat salmon, you eat vegetables grown with pesticides, you drink water with trace residues, you breathe air with particulate matter. Low-level exposures accumulate, not necessarily in dynamic spikes, but in subtle layers, over years, over decades. Scientists call this cumulative exposure, or mixture effects. Studying mixtures is extraordinarily complex because chemicals can interact. They can amplify each other, cancel each other out, interfere with hormone signaling in non-linear ways. The mathematics become exponential. The regulatory burden becomes enormous. So the system simplifies. Test individually, set limits conservatively, monitor trends. That simplification keeps society functional, but it also hides complexity from public view. And here's where the narrative shifts from chemistry to psychology, because most people hear, quote, within limits and translate it to, quote, safe. But regulators often mean tolerable under modeled conditions. Those are not identical statements. Tolerable implies managed risk. Safe implies absence of concern. Modern systems operate in tolerable. Marketing language often implies safe. That subtle difference shapes perception. Now let's introduce time again. Many environmental toxins do not cause immediate visible harm. They contribute to long-term processes. Cancer risk, endocrine disruption, neurological development. These processes unfold over decades. When outcomes take decades to appear, proving causation becomes difficult. Chronic disease is multifactorial. Diet, exercise, stress, genetics, socioeconomic status, environmental background. With so many moving parts, isolating one contributor becomes statistically challenging, which means regulatory tightening often follows strong, undeniable evidence, not early suspicion. And strong evidence takes time. This is not a story of villainy. It is a story of inertia. Systems built to avoid panic change slowly. Industries with economic weight influence timing. Now consider economics more directly. Aquaculture is not a niche hobby. It is a global industry worth tens of billions annually. In Norway, salmon exports are a major economic pillar. In Scotland, coastal communities depend on it. In Chile, entire regions are economically structured around it. In Canada, supply chains extend into transportation, processing, and retail. When an industry becomes economically central, regulatory decisions carry economic consequences. Stricter limits usually mean higher production costs, feed reformulation, infrastructure upgrades, treatment alternatives, compliance testings. Those costs just ripple outward. Prices increase, competitiveness shifts, employment fluctuates. Governments must weigh health protection against economic stability. This balancing act is rarely visible at the fish counter, but it shapes the thresholds behind that fillet. And here is something subtle. Industry is not static. When early 2000s studies raised concerns about higher contaminant levels in farmed salmon, feed practices shifted. Fish oil sourcing improved. Filtration technologies expanded. Plant-based ingredients increased. In many monitored regions, contaminant levels declined. This is important because it shows that regulatory pressure and industry response can produce improvement. But improvement is incremental, gradual, rarely revolutionary. Now let's bring in history, not to create fear, but to create perspective. There was a time when leaded gasoline was considered acceptable. The science of low-dose neurological damage was incomplete. Industry influence was strong. Phasing it out took decades. Asbestos was widely used in construction. Regulatory restriction followed after long-term health consequences became undeniable. DDT was approved for agricultural use. Ecological impacts accumulated over time. In each case, regulators operated within the best available evidence of their era. Standards evolved, knowledge expanded, thresholds shifted. This does not mean that salmon today is tomorrow's asbestos. It means regulatory approval is provincial, dynamic, dependent on evolving science. Now zoom back to the supermarket. The packaging does not say, "This product complies with tolerable weekly intake modeling based on average body weight and probabilistic cancer thresholds." It says, "Heart healthy, omega-3, sustainably sourced." That is not deception, it is marketing. Marketing highlights benefit. It does not highlight uncertainty. And consumers rarely seek out regulatory databases. They trust the label. Trust reduces cognitive load. It allows daily life to function. But trust without curiosity becomes passive. And passive trust just disconnects you from the system you depend on. Let's be very clear. Salmon provides real nutritional benefit. EPH and DHA are not fictional. Protein is not fictional. For many individuals, including those who eat fish moderately, benefits may indeed outweigh modeled risks. But the phrase benefits outweighs risks is itself a statistical statement. It assumes population averages, it assumes moderate consumption, it assumes background exposure patterns. If someone eats salmon every day, if someone already has elevated exposure from other sources, if someone belongs to a sensitive subgroup, the calculation changes. That does not mean panic. It means context. Modern safety systems are designed around moderation variation, diversity of diet, not single food dominance, which brings us back to agency. Regulators model, industry optimizes, government balances, but individuals choose. And choice informed by understanding is different from choice informed by marketing alone. If you are still here, you are not looking for outrage. You are looking for clarity, because clarity replaces emotional reaction with deliberate decision. And deliberate decision is powerful. In the next and final segment, we will pull all of this together: industrial biology, regulatory math, economic incentives, historical precedents, your ability to choose for yourself. So that when you stand at the fish counter again, the decision is not reflex, it is conscious. Let's bring this home, because by now you can see that this conversation is not really about salmon. It's about how modern systems define safety. It's about how institutions decide what level of risk is acceptable for millions of people. And it's about whether we understand that process or simply inherit it without question. Go back to that fish counter, the pink fillet, the clean packaging, the confidence. Nothing about that moment communicates probability modeling. Nothing communicates safety factors. Nothing communicates that acceptable is a negotiated line drawn between science, economics, feasibility, and political will. You see a product, but what you are actually looking at is a decision tree, a chain of regulatory choices, a set of assumptions, a balance between precaution and practicality. And here's where institutional skepticism becomes healthy, not hostile. Skepticism does not mean assuming corruption. It means understanding incentives. Regulatory agents are staffed with scientists, but those agencies operate inside political systems. Political systems operate inside economic realities. Economic realities influence timelines. This is not about evil people in dark rooms. It's about structural alignment. When an industry supports jobs, exports, and tax revenue, it gains gravity. Gravity slows abrupt change. Standards tighten, but gradually. Improvements happen, but incrementally. Rarely do we see radical shifts unless overwhelming evidence forces them. And overwhelming evidence takes time. That lag between suspicion and action is built into the architecture of regulation. We usually tighten rules after a problem becomes undeniable, not before. Why? Because precaution has economic cost. and policymakers must justify that cost. That is the system. Now, layer this understanding onto food. Modern diets are not built on zero exposure. They are built on distributed exposure. Small amounts here, small amounts there, below thresholds, below limits, within tolerable ranges. But tolerable is not the same as invisible. Your body does not reset because a regulatory review occurred. Your cumulative exposure does not disappear because a standard was updated. Risk management assumes diversity, rotation, moderation. That is rarely said explicitly, but it is embedded in how limits are constructed. For example, tolerable weekly intake levels for certain compounds assume moderate consumption, not daily maximum exposure from a single source for decades, which means personal behavior still matters. The system manages averages. You live an individual life. Now let's zoom out even further. There is a psychological comfort in believing that safety is absolute, that if something is on the shelf, it has passed a binary test, safe or unsafe, allowed or banned. But modern safety does not function in binaries. It functions in gradients, risk curves, probability bands, safety margins. That complexity does not fit neatly onto packaging. So it's simplified, and simplification makes society manageable. But simplification also hides nuance, and nuance is where informed choice lives. Here is something important. The presence of industrial chemicals in farming does not automatically translate to dangerous residues in the final product. Regulatory withdrawal periods exist. Maximum residue limits exist. Monitoring exists. But awareness of the process changes how you see the product. When you know that sea lice treatments involve compounds requiring protective equipment for workers, you understand the scale of the management. When you know that antibiotics are tightly regulated in some countries and much more heavily used in others, you understand regional variation. When you know that contaminant levels have decreased in many farm systems over the past 2 decades, you understand adaptive response. Reality is not a single headline, it is layered, and layered understanding produces calm, not panic. Now let's address something directly. For those of you who do not fully trust government thresholds, you are not irrational. Skepticism toward regulatory limits often comes from historical memory. Leaded gasoline, asbestos, certain pesticides, tobacco. In each case, standards once deemed safe were later reconsidered. So when someone says it's within limits and you respond, yes, but limits change. That is not conspiracy thinking, it is pattern recognition. Limits do change as science evolves, as political climates shift, as public pressure rises. The question is not whether limits change. They do. The question is how much margin you personally want between your behavior and the line. Some people are comfortable at the threshold. Others prefer distance. That is not hysteria, it is preference, and preference is allowed. Now let's make this practical. If you eat salmon once or twice per week as part of a varied diet, you are operating inside the assumptions most regulatory systems are built around. If you eat salmon daily as your primary protein source for years, you move closer to modeled upper ranges. Does that mean harm is guaranteed? No. But it means the margin narrows, and margin is where comfort lives. Diversifying protein sources reduces cumulative exposure from any single food, rotating between salmon, sardines, mackerel, shellfish, plant proteins, and other options spread risk. It also spreads nutrient profiles. Moderation is not fear, it is strategy. Now return to the larger theme. Modern safety is about managing risk, not eliminating it. That sentence matters because eliminating risk entirely would collapse complex supply chains. Modern society is built on controlled imperfection, acceptable imperfection, negotiated imperfection. That reality is neither utopian nor dystopian. It's practical. But practical systems deserve informed citizens, and informed citizens ask questions, not to destroy trust, but to calibrate it. Trust and skepticism are not opposites, they are partners. Blind trust is fragile. Total cynicism is exhausting. Informed trust is resilient. It allows you to acknowledge benefit and uncertainty at the same time. Salmon can be nutritious. Industrial farming can involve chemical management. Regulatory limits can be science-based. And it's not set in stone. All of those statements can be true simultaneously. And now, imagine standing at that fish counter again. You see the pink fillet, but this time you also see the invisible layers, the feed formulation, the parasite management, the safety factor calculations, the export economics, the regulatory committees, the incremental revisions, the historical precedents. You are no longer reacting to marketing. You are interpreting a system, and once you understand it, you can choose for yourself. Being informed doesn't mean you have to reject it. It means choice. Maybe you buy it. Maybe you buy it less often. Maybe you ask where it was farmed. Maybe you rotate your diet. The point is not elimination. The point is awareness. Because awareness dissolves that illusion that safety is binary. Safety is managed, modeled, adjusted, and lived within. That understanding removes fear, but it also removes naivety, which is healthier. Now, pause, because here's the core takeaway. When someone says, if it were dangerous, they wouldn't be allowed to sell it, the more accurate statement is, if it were judged to exceed acceptable modeled risk under current standards, it wouldn't be allowed to sell. That is a different sentence. Less comforting, more honest. And honesty is stabilizing. You live in a world of probabilities. You always have. Food is not unique in this. Air quality standards are modeled. Water purity standards are modeled. Medication side effects are modeled. We accept small risks daily because zero risk is impossible. But accepting small risks consciously is different from accepting them blindly. The difference is maturity. So here's where we end. You do not need to outrage. You do not need to fear. You do not need denial. You need clarity. Clarity about how systems work. Clarity about how acceptable risk is constructed. Clarity about how economics and science intersect. Clarity about how your personal choices interact with population averages. Modern safety is negotiated, dynamic, imperfect. Understanding that does not weaken you, it strengthens you, because informed choice is the only real control individuals have inside complex systems. The next time you stand at the fish counter, pause. Not in anxiety, in awareness. Look at that fillet and understand the architecture behind it. Then decide what acceptable means for you. That is not rebellion, it is responsibility. Thank you for listening. If this conversation expanded how you see the food on your plate, leave a comment. Share it with someone who thinks safety is simple. And remember, curiosity is the ultimate safeguard. We'll see you in the next one.